Traditionally, a piece of jewelry can begin two ways. It can begin with an idea and a drawing, or it can begin with a stone. And depending on the houses, actually, you will see that some privilege one or the other. When you start with a stone or a set of stones, it's pretty obvious. I mean, you have selected stones according to your criteria, and then you decide from the stone to turn them into a necklace, a bracelet, a ring. When you start more from an inspiration, which is probably what we are most famous for, you will start with a story very often. And let's say, for instance, you want to create a collection inspired by Jules Verne, which we did a couple of years ago. Then you would start with the text, say, okay, that's 20,000 leagues behind the sea. Designers will read or reread the novel, find some moments, some chapters that inspire them, and then they will start to sketch, knowing that we have at Cleef Arpels one step which is a bit unusual, even in the jewelry world, which is that after a final drawing, we usually create a three-dimensional mock-up using non-precious materials like pewter, for instance, and fake stones, in order to create a kind of realistic rendering of the piece before we actually go into production, which is very, very important when you work on unique pieces, because you only have one go at the piece. For complex pieces, you really want to solve any potential issues or questions before you start really sculpting the metal and cutting the stones, where the jeweler and the designer are really working hand in hand to kind of express in volume, in 3D, what was originally imagined in 2D on a sheet of paper. Literature, art, film, theater, poetry, nature. Actually, all these inspirations, they're kind of a combination of three elements. The main element is about the archive and the history of the house. So all of the stories have to be consistent with and rooted in the house's history. I don't believe that you can, start going in a radically different direction or do something that has nothing to do with what the house is about. So in that sense, we have kind of wide inspirations that are about nature, about the world of ballet, about the world of couture, fairy tales and stories. So these are kind of, let's say groups of inspiration, some kind of key sources that are really part of the whole history of the house. And we try, collection after collection, to give these inspirations new interpretations, or in a way to bring new chapters in the same story. And so we will try to associate this inspiration with very often a work of art. It can be, a book, a theater, play, a poem, a place, a movie, or a period in time that resonate with one of these key inspirations. And then the third component, which is sometimes less identified, is that it has to resonate with the time we're living in, something that's in the air. To give you an example, for instance, probably the first collection that we did in that sense, there was these fantastic brooches from the 1940s that are figurative brooches in the shape of fairies. So instead of trying to reinterpret or modernize or reproduce these pieces from the past, actually we tried to take one step back and to say, okay, where is it coming from? Actually, why did the house start to design these fairies? And this is where you start really to bring some books and to go back to fairy tales, and that led us to William Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, because this is where this representation of fairies really appears in Western culture. And so we decided to create a whole collection inspired by the play. And at the time we did that collection, that's already a while ago, it was in the air. I mean, it was really the time when Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings were just out, and this idea of magic and fairy tales were kind of coming back. The last collection we did, which is called Seven Seas, which is more inspired by seas and oceans, but under the lens of Middle Age and Renaissance travels, and going from the one sea to the other, discovering, after the Mediterranean Sea, the Red Sea, the Black Sea, the Adriatic. Old description of the Red Sea, there was really that idea that the sea was red, so you start to go for different colors than purely shades of blues and green. At the same time, we worked on that collection 2 years ago. There was in other categories, or in fashion and couture, cruise collections, and that idea of coming back to the idea of elegant travel at sea, and all these inspirations from the oceans. The very, very strong designs, the ones that have resisted time, once again in our world, are the ones that were created 70 or 80 years ago, and that you still feel, when you look at them today, they could have been designed yesterday. To me, probably one of the best examples of that is the zip necklace, which remains one of the most daring design, extremely contemporary in a way, but that was originally designed in the 1930s. So this is really what we try to look for. It's more about timelessness and relevance. To us, the design and development of watches is above all an expression of the identity of Cleef Arpels. What I mean by that is that we don't think, oh, we're going to create a watch. So, what are the current trends? What are the standards in watchmaking today? We start once again with a story, and some of our stories actually translate better into watches than even into jewelry. And when we design a watch, we try to express an idea of time, a vision of time, which is, I believe, quite specific to the house. So our vision of time is not about, accuracy. It's not a masculine, sports-oriented vision. It's not about performance. It's more about poetry. It's more about the cycles and the rhythms of nature. So it's a time that goes probably more slowly, that has a narrative element. It's pretty much, the time it takes to tell a story, rather than the time it takes to measure the speed of an event or performance. Maybe it's a bit philosophical, but it's really the starting point. And then this is what's going to drive the whole process. One of our watches that is probably the best known today is a watch that shows the time through two lovers that are walking on a bridge, in Paris at night and going towards each other. And it's a watch with an amazingly complex movement, but you don't see the movement. The movement is just here to serve the story and to make sure that you bring these two characters to life, and that, as the day goes by, they would get closer and closer. So this is very much the philosophy of our watches, and you will find in the watches a lot of these figurative inspirations that you find also in the jewelry. Some of them, coming from the nature, so butterflies, dragonflies, flowers, leaves, but also fairies, mermaids, lovers. And we always try to capture, the movement that can animate them, and to use the possibilities of mechanical watchmaking to really bring that physical movement, and to make sure that that flower is going to open up, that butterfly is going to fly on the dial.